On the morning of November 1st, 2002, a 54-year-old man named Lonnie Turner stood inside the back room of a funeral home, carefully trimming the hair on a dead man's head. Lonnie was the owner and head mortician of the Jones Funeral Home in Navasota, Texas, which is a small town just north of Houston. Lonnie had already drained the blood from the body and filled its veins with embalming fluid. Once he wrapped up the haircut, he dressed the body and then applied makeup, before moving it into its casket for the wake that afternoon. When he was done, Lonnie headed down the hallway and up the steps to his office. The whole time he walked, his feet ached. Lonnie was only 54, but lately, he'd been feeling exhausted from his job, and from all the volunteering he did outside of work. As he reached the sitting area outside his office, he looked at the photos that lined the walls. There were pictures of Lonnie with the town mayor, the Chamber of Commerce, and the Navasota School Board. He was the first African-American member of the Navasota City Council, and just 2 years ago, he'd received the Citizen of the Year award from the Chamber of Commerce. The plaque hung on the wall just outside his office, and every time he looked at it, he felt a swell of pride. But when he went into his office, Lonnie's smile quickly faded. Because his 21-year-old son, Junior, was sitting in Lonnie's chair with his feet up on Lonnie's desk, talking loudly nonstop into his cell phone. Lonnie tried to get his son's attention, but Junior just clearly ignored him. So Lonnie just stood there, arms crossed, giving his son a very stern look. Finally, Junior stopped talking on the phone and turned to face his dad. But instead of saying hello to him, he told his dad that he was about to register for the Texas Mortuary Law Exam, which he had to pass to get his mortician's license. And getting that license was the very first step for Junior to be able to take over the family business, something Lonnie was all too aware of. Now, Lonnie knew part of Junior probably just wanted to get out of his father's shadow. It had to be hard sometimes when your father was one of the most well-known people in town, but as much as Lonnie did want to hand over the funeral business to his son, he wasn't going to do that until he felt certain that his son could actually handle it. Because currently, his son acted really immature basically all the time. And so instead of Lonnie reacting to what his son had just told him about taking this mortuary exam, Lonnie just said, okay, well, there's still work to be done here at the funeral home. And then before Junior could protest, he told him he had to move their latest client's coffin into the chapel for the wake, he needed to order more embalming fluid, and get the company car washed. Then Lonnie threw the car keys to his son, and after Junior grabbed him, he just stood up and stormed out of the office looking totally annoyed. But Lonnie didn't care. He was tired of his son's bad attitude and entitled behavior, and he knew he needed to be tougher on Junior. If he didn't, he felt like Junior's habit of being sort of lazy could land him in serious trouble. Just then, Lonnie heard voices coming from outside of his office. He peeked into the hallway, and he saw his son talking to another young man. It was 19-year-old James White, Lonnie's godson. James had grown up around Lonnie's family, and had always looked at Lonnie like an uncle and at Junior like an older brother. Now, James worked part-time at the funeral home with both of them. But as Lonnie listened to this conversation that was going on, he realized his son was telling James to do several of the tasks that Lonnie had literally just assigned him. And he'd caught Junior doing this before, paying James extra to do work he wanted to avoid, and taking advantage of the fact that James looked up to him and would basically do whatever he asked. And this made Lonnie furious, because he didn't give Junior tasks just to keep him busy. They were a way of preparing him to take over this business. For Lonnie, this was just further proof that his son was not ready for serious responsibility. Lonnie sighed, but he didn't confront his son or James. He just let them do their work and then told them to leave early. Once they were gone, Lonnie spent the afternoon making preparations for upcoming funerals and speaking to grieving family members. By the time he could finally head home, he was totally exhausted. After locking up the funeral home, Lonnie drove through downtown Navasota towards a small neighborhood at the edge of town. When he pulled up in front of his big 2-story house, it was dark outside. He parked and walked around the house to the back porch. The light was on and the back door was unlocked, just like Lonnie always left it. He went inside and noticed that Junior wasn't home yet. Lonnie assumed he was out with his friends, like usual. So Lonnie just turned on the TV and made himself some dinner. He ate, watched some local news, and then spoke to a client on the phone around 9:15. They talked for a few minutes, and then after that, Lonnie headed to bed. And he was so tired from work that day that he fell asleep pretty much immediately. And he was sleeping soundly when suddenly there was this loud creaking noise that woke him up. Lonnie sat upright in bed, confused, and before his eyes could adjust to the darkness, he heard something else. The sound of breathing. Someone else was in the room with him. A couple hours later, just before midnight, Lonnie's son, Junior, pulled into the driveway outside the house. As always, he walked around to the back porch as well. But when he got there, he noticed the porch light wasn't on, and it typically was. And so he checked the bulb and actually found that it was slightly unscrewed. So he tightened it until the light came back on. After that, he opened the unlocked door and went inside. He headed upstairs to his bedroom, but on the way there, he noticed his father's bedroom door was open. Now, his dad always slept with the door shut, and it wasn't like him to be up this late. So Junior called out and asked if everything was okay, but there was no response. So Junior walked closer to the open door and peeked inside. But when he did, he saw his dad was not in bed. Instead, Lonnie was lying on the floor beside the bed, perfectly still. And on the wall above him was a huge, dark red streak of blood. Junior just stared for a moment in shock, and then immediately turned and sprinted to his bedroom. There, he lifted up his mattress, revealing a collection of handguns, and he grabbed one at random. He jammed the gun into the waistband of his pants and then fled down the stairs. Junior burst through the back door, jumped into his car, and started speeding towards the nearest police station. As he drove, he used his cell phone to call 911. When the dispatcher asked what the emergency was, Junior told them his dad had been shot and killed. When they asked if he had checked for a pulse, he admitted that he hadn't. He said he'd left in a hurry because he was scared whoever had killed his dad might still be in the house. While Junior was speeding to the police station, an officer named Rob Bailey was patrolling the town. It had been a quiet night, that is until his radio crackled, and dispatch told him that a deadly shooting had just been reported at an address on the edge of town, and the shooter might still be inside the building. And Officer Bailey immediately recognized the address, because, like most officers on the Navasota police force, he knew Lonnie and the entire Turner family personally. And so he sped to Lonnie's house, praying that his friend was okay. When he got there, he parked and headed straight to the backyard, because he knew Lonnie always went in through his back door. But while he was rounding the house, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. The lights were on downstairs, and he could see someone moving around inside. Now, part of Officer Bailey hoped that this shadowy figure was Lonnie himself, and that despite the report of a deadly shooting here, that Lonnie was somehow okay. But he knew that wasn't likely. More likely was this shadowy figure was the shooter. And so with his hand on his sidearm, Officer Bailey carefully walked to the back porch and knocked on the back door. There was a long moment of silence, then he heard footsteps from inside. The door opened, and when Officer Bailey saw who was standing there, he was confused. He recognized the man. But it wasn't Lonnie Turner. It was Lonnie's brother, Lawson, which was very unusual because the officer knew that Lawson lived almost 3 hours away. And as for Lawson, he also looked confused to be seeing a police officer standing at the door. And when Officer Bailey told him that he was actually here responding to a possible shooting, Lawson looked even more bewildered. He said he didn't know anything about a shooting and said he had only arrived a few minutes ago and found the house totally empty. Officer Bailey didn't know what to make of that, but he asked Lawson to please wait outside, and then Officer Bailey went into the house. Bailey went straight to Lonnie's bedroom, and there, just as Junior had described it, he would find Lonnie Turner laying on the ground beside the bed, with the wall streaked with blood behind him. Bailey leaned down to check his friend for a pulse, but there wasn't one. Officer Bailey just stood there for a moment, struggling to process the fact that his friend and one of the most respected men in the city was dead, most likely murdered. A moment later, Officer Bailey collected himself and radioed for backup. After that, he remembered that he had a possible suspect waiting outside. Officer Bailey rushed downstairs and out into the backyard. Lawson seemed eager for news about whatever was going on, but Officer Bailey wasn't sure how much he should say. He was a patrol officer, not a homicide investigator, so he was kind of out of his depth. But he still felt like he had to do something. So he asked Lawson what he was doing at his brother's house. Lawson said he was on his way to Houston and he was planning to spend the night at his brother's house to break up the drive. He said he'd gotten to the house just a few minutes before Officer Bailey did, and when he'd gone inside, he'd called out for Lonnie, but no one had answered. He'd even looked in Lonnie's bedroom and didn't see him, so he figured Lonnie was out dealing with some funeral home business and would be back soon. And listening to this, Officer Bailey literally couldn't believe what Lawson was saying. The walls in Lonnie's bedroom were literally covered in blood, and his brother's body was literally laying on the floor in front of him. It didn't make sense that Lawson could have looked inside that room and not noticed those things. So even though Officer Bailey was not a detective and was not in charge of this case, he wanted to see how Lawson would react to the news of his brother's death. So he just came right out and told him. And when he did, Lawson looked shocked and then totally devastated, and then he broke down sobbing. Officer Bailey watched him, trying to judge if his tears were genuine, but he couldn't tell. But just then, Officer Bailey looked up and saw headlights approaching the house. Detective Travis Higginbotham parked in Lonnie's driveway. Higginbotham worked for the district attorney's office and had been appointed as the lead investigator on this case. He already knew that the murder of a local celebrity would garner plenty of attention, and also the fact that the Texas Rangers, who were the state police, had been called in to help on this case only made it more high profile. And so for Detective Higginbotham, he knew this case could either make his career or break it. Higginbotham got out of his car and met up with Officer Bailey in the backyard, and he was surprised to see another man was sitting outside and crying. Officer Bailey quickly explained the situation, and the detective agreed that Lawson seemed suspicious. But before Higginbotham could even begin to think about that, he needed to go inside and survey the crime scene. He went to Lonnie's bedroom and took note of the trajectory of the blood spatter on the walls. Then he examined Lonnie's body, and the detective found 2 bullet casings from a 9mm pistol nearby. Given the location of the wounds and the fact that there was no gun anywhere in the room, it was fairly obvious this couldn't be a suicide. So Detective Higginbotham started looking around for clues about a possible motive for murder. Nothing in Lonnie's bedroom, or the rest of the house for that matter, had been disturbed. Lonnie's wallet and his watch were out in plain sight, and there was also $7,000 in cash in an unlocked safe. So it didn't seem like the motive for this was robbery. There were also no signs of a break-in, which made sense considering Lonnie kept his back door unlocked. But that also meant whoever killed Lonnie likely knew in advance he did not lock his back door. So it seemed like a working theory was whoever killed Lonnie knew him personally and maybe had some kind of vendetta against him. As he was thinking this over, Detective Higginbotham heard Lonnie's brother, Lawson, still sobbing outside in the yard. And so Higginbotham got up and headed out to question him. Lawson was clearly distraught, and he started by just repeating everything he'd already told Officer Bailey. And like Officer Bailey, Detective Higginbotham found his story to be very suspicious. The idea he looked in his brother's room and didn't notice his brother's body or the blood on the wall just didn't make any sense. So Higginbotham leaned forward and asked Lawson a much more pointed question. Did he own a gun? Without hesitating, Lawson said yes. He actually had it in his car right now. Lawson led Detective Higginbotham to his car and pointed at a pistol that was just sitting out in the back seat. But the detective saw right away the gun was a .32, not a 9mm, so it very likely was not the murder weapon. But Higginbotham did not think that proved Lawson was innocent, so he decided to bring him to the station, not for more questioning, but for a test. Once they were at the police station, Higginbotham had Lawson's hands swabbed for gunshot residue. The idea was to see if he had fired a gun recently, like that evening. But the results came back negative. Lawson did not have gunshot residue on his hands. However, that didn't totally rule out the possibility that he had fired a gun that evening, because Lawson could have fired a gun with gloves on. Or he could have just vigorously washed his hands afterwards. And so because Detective Higginbotham didn't have any other evidence against Lawson, he had to let him go for now. But the detective was not totally disappointed, because he had another person of interest waiting for him right down the hall. In a nearby interview room, a Texas Ranger was already questioning Lonnie's son, Junior. Detective Higginbotham joined their session and began observing Junior's behavior. Unlike Lawson, who'd been devastated by his brother's death, Junior seemed strangely calm. And his story also seemed very suspicious. According to Junior, when he'd seen the blood on his dad's wall, he had immediately assumed that his dad was shot and killed, even though he didn't hear gunshots or see shell casings, and he didn't check to see if his dad still had a pulse. Junior claimed this was all just gut instinct, but Detective Higginbotham thought it sounded more like Junior already knew what had happened before he'd ever stepped foot into his father's room. But again, Junior swore that was not true. He said he'd been terrified that whoever had shot his dad was still in the house, so he grabbed one of his own guns to protect himself, and then to prove his story, Junior pulled a handgun from his belt and placed it on the table. Higginbotham was stunned. Civilians were not supposed to be allowed to bring weapons into police stations. The detective didn't even know how Junior managed to get the gun inside. But regardless, Junior having a gun during his interview definitely did not make him look any less guilty. However, when Detective Higginbotham took a closer look at the weapon, he saw it was not a 9mm. But still, if Junior owned an arsenal of handguns, the detective figured there could be a 9mm in there somewhere. So, just to be safe, Detective Higginbotham also had Junior's hands swabbed for gunshot residue. And this time, the test came back positive, which would typically mean that Junior fired a weapon that night. But once again, the results were inconclusive, because in theory, Junior could have gotten that residue on his hands simply by handling the pistol he brought into the station. Higginbotham was weighing this possibility when he got a call from the team of investigators who were still collecting evidence at the crime scene. They'd just found the cache of guns under Junior's mattress, and one of them was a 9mm pistol. Now, it would have to be tested against the shell casings found at the crime scene, which would take time, but it could be the murder weapon. And when Higginbotham confronted Junior about this, Junior's response shocked the detective, because Junior claimed that that specific 9mm gun had actually disappeared from his collection several weeks ago. He had no idea how it had gotten back under his mattress. To the detective, this excuse sounded ridiculous, but he asked Junior if, when the gun went missing, did you report it missing? And Junior said no. At this point, Junior's story seemed to be getting flimsier and flimsier. But one thing prevented Detective Higginbotham from arresting him on the spot. Junior claimed to have an alibi. He said he had spent most of the night hanging out with his girlfriend. They ate at a restaurant, then headed to her place for a few hours, and then on his way home after the date, he stopped at a car wash. Higginbotham wrote down Junior's girlfriend's name, as well as the name of the car wash, so he could look into the alibi later. In the meantime, he let Junior go, but promised they would speak again soon. The next morning, Detective Higginbotham made several calls to verify Junior's alibi, and pretty much everything Junior had said checked out. He'd definitely been to his girlfriend's house and the car wash, but there were still small gaps in his schedule where he theoretically could have had time to go home and kill his dad. The detective sighed. Junior and Lawson both had such unbelievable stories. He was sure one of them was lying, but he just couldn't tell which one. Just then, the phone on Detective Higginbotham's desk rang. It was the district attorney, and he had big news. A police officer who'd been cataloging evidence at Lonnie's house had gone on a smoke break, and when he did, he found a pair of gloves and a makeshift mask lying in a creek just 25 yards from Lonnie's front door. Detective Higginbotham's eyes went wide. He knew that if Lonnie's killer had worn that mask, it would probably still carry trace amounts of their saliva, which would contain their DNA. Testing the mask for DNA would take time, but it could potentially solve the case. Higginbotham ended the call feeling much more optimistic about the case. He arranged for DNA samples to be collected from Junior and Lawson so he could compare them to the mask. But almost as soon as the detective did that, he received another phone call. And this one sent him in a totally different direction. That call was from a Texas Ranger who said he'd done some digging, and he had discovered a criminal case involving Lonnie from a few months before his death. Apparently, a thief had stolen several blank checks from Lonnie's office, then made them out to himself, forged Lonnie's signature, and stole close to $8,000 from Lonnie's account. Lonnie found out and pressed charges. And because he pressed charges, this meant the police had copies of those fraudulent checks, and those checks had the thief's name written on them. The thief was Lonnie's 19-year-old godson, James White. After speaking to the Texas Ranger, Higginbotham asked around and learned that James White worked part-time at the funeral home. Evidently, Lonnie had forgiven him for the theft, but Detective Higginbotham didn't think that made James trustworthy. In fact, he thought that James could be just as strong of a suspect as Junior and Lawson. James was close to the family, he likely knew that Lonnie kept his back door unlocked, he also might have even known where Junior hid his guns. And so Detective Higginbotham knew he needed to question James immediately. So he made some calls, and before long, he managed to track James down. James seemed very upset about the death of his godfather, but he was very cooperative and answered all of the detective's questions. And he admitted to forging the checks, but vehemently denied any involvement in Lonnie's death. And like Junior, he had an alibi for the night of the murder. James said he had been at a club in a neighboring town with some friends who would all be able to confirm the story. Detective Higginbotham promised to contact them. Then he thought back to the mask that had been found outside of Lonnie's home, and he asked if James would be willing to provide a voluntary DNA sample. And right away, James said yes. Higginbotham collected a DNA sample from James and then headed back to the DA's office. When he got there, he sent James's DNA to be tested alongside the mask, just like Junior's and Lawson's. After that, he went into his office and he found a report on his desk. It was from the ballistics lab. They'd analyzed the shell casings from the crime scene and the 9mm pistol found under Junior's mattress, and they had confirmed what Detective Higginbotham already suspected. Junior's 9mm gun was in fact the murder weapon. Reading this, Detective Higginbotham was ready to arrest Junior right then, but when he asked the district attorney for approval, he said no. The DA said it was too early to make an arrest. With all the attention Lonnie's murder was getting, their case needed to be airtight. So before they made their move, they had to wait for the results of the DNA test on that mask. Detective Higginbotham knew there was always a chance the DNA test results could be inconclusive and get them nothing. So he continued to investigate his main suspects, and he kept an especially close eye on Junior. And in the weeks following his father's death, Junior went on a massive shopping spree with his inheritance. He bought an expensive boat and a luxury car, and he also hired a lawyer, even though he had not been charged with anything. This only made the detective more certain that Junior had to be guilty, and he was about to march into the DA's office and ask for permission to arrest Junior again, but he knew what they'd say. He would need more evidence. But then, 2 months after Lonnie's death, Higginbotham heard from a fellow detective that a different suspect was also behaving erratically. Lonnie's godson, James, had been caught trying to rob a bar, and during the robbery, he hit the owner of the bar with a cash register. Clearly, James was hard up for cash and willing to go to extreme and violent lengths to get it. With this, Detective Higginbotham found himself feeling totally overwhelmed by all the evidence against each of his potential suspects. However, all this evidence was kind of all over the place. He couldn't really put it all together. And so he went into his office, sat down at his desk, and went back over all the information he had about James, Lawson, and Junior. James was a known thief with access to Lonnie's house. He could have easily gotten inside and killed Lonnie during a robbery gone wrong. However, no valuables had been taken from the crime scene, which didn't seem to add up if the motive was burglary. Then there was Lawson. He was literally in the house when police arrived, and his story about looking in his brother's bedroom and not noticing the blood on the wall or the body on the ground was hard to believe. And finally, there was Junior. Junior owned the murder weapon and had gunshot residue on his hands on the night of the murder, and also the fact that he fled the crime scene before verifying that his father was actually dead still just didn't sit right with Detective Higginbotham. And most importantly, Junior stood to benefit the most from his father's death. With Lonnie out of the way, he inherited a significant amount of money and a successful funeral home business. And so Detective Higginbotham was sure he was so close to figuring out who killed Lonnie. And sure enough, just a few days later, the DNA test results from the mask came back. And when Higginbotham saw them, he knew the case was solved. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Lonnie Turner on the evening of November 1st, 2002. That night, sometime between 9:15 and 10 p.m., the killer drove into Lonnie's neighborhood with their headlights off. They parked outside of Lonnie's house, then put on their gloves and their mask, a mask they had made earlier by cutting holes in a gym shoe bag. Now, if all went according to their plan, no one would see them tonight. But if somebody did catch a glimpse of them, the killer could not afford to be recognized. And so as an extra safety measure, the killer grabbed a 9mm pistol that they'd brought with them, and then stepped out of the car and hurried towards the back of Lonnie's house. When they got to the porch, they reached up and unscrewed the porch light bulb just enough to break the circuit and kill the light. Then the killer reached for the doorknob, and as expected, it was unlocked. The killer headed inside and went straight for the master bedroom. They knew the thing they'd come here for was inside of that room. They reached the door, turned the knob, and carefully pushed the door open just a crack. The killer peeked inside. He saw Lonnie was lying in bed, snoring. The killer watched Lonnie for several seconds. They knew entering the room was risky, but at this point, they'd come too far to turn back now. So eventually, they pushed the door open further and began to go inside. However, the killer only got 1 foot into the bedroom before the door made a loud creaking sound. The killer froze. They looked over at the bed, and to their horror, Lonnie stopped snoring, sat up suddenly, and looked right over at them. For a moment, the two just stared at each other. The killer had no idea if Lonnie could recognize them with their mask on, but Lonnie looked like he was about to stand up and confront them, so in a panic, the killer raised their gun and fired. Lonnie screamed, and the killer immediately fired again, and Lonnie went limp and then rolled off the bed onto the ground. The killer was so shocked by what they'd done that they didn't even wait to see if Lonnie was dead. Instead, they just turned and ran out of the room, completely forgetting the thing they had come here for. And the killer was almost out the door and out of Lonnie's house when they realized they couldn't just flee the scene while carrying the murder weapon. So they ran back inside, went to another bedroom, lifted up the mattress, and dropped the gun underneath. After that, the killer sprinted out the back door, tore off their gloves and mask, tossed them in a nearby ditch, and then jumped into their car and sped away. In their panic, the killer never considered the fact that they had been breathing through that mask the entire time they were in the house. So they didn't realize that that mask was full of their DNA. And so if investigators got the mask, it would lead them directly to the killer. When Detective Higginbotham saw the DNA test results, he knew the killer was not Lonnie's son, Junior, who owned the murder weapon, and it wasn't Lonnie's brother, Lawson, who was in the house when police showed up. Instead, the killer was James White, Lonnie Turner's 19-year-old godson. James was desperate for money and willing to do just about anything to get it. And he'd been to Lonnie's house countless times, so he knew Lonnie kept the back door unlocked and he kept a safe full of cash in the master bedroom. He also knew where Junior kept his gun collection. So James planned a robbery. He bought a pair of gloves and made that makeshift mask, and then 2 weeks before the murder, he stole the 9mm pistol from under Junior's mattress. not because he wanted to kill Lonnie, but just in case anything went wrong. Finally, on the evening of November 1st, James put his plan into action. But when the bedroom door creaked and it woke Lonnie up, James knew he was caught. So he shot Lonnie in a panic and then ran away without even taking any money, even though Lonnie's safe, which contained $7,000 in cash, was sitting unlocked not far away. Which means James killed his godfather for nothing. James was arrested and quickly confessed to pulling the trigger. He also admitted that he'd convinced his friends to lie about his alibi. However, James insisted that the crime was not actually his idea. He claimed Lonnie's son, Junior, had literally forced him to commit the murder at gunpoint because Junior wanted his inheritance. However, there was no evidence suggesting that actually happened. Ultimately, James White would make a plea deal and received a 20-year sentence.
In 2012, 35-year-old Jose Alvarenga was an extremely experienced fisherman, having spent years and years commercially fishing. In November of that year, Jose volunteered to do a 30-hour deep-sea fishing shift for his company off the coast of his hometown in Mexico. He hoped he'd be able to catch some sharks, marlins, and sailfish, 3 of the more lucrative fish you can catch. Unfortunately, the guy Jose usually went deep-sea fishing with was not able to go at the last minute, but Jose still really wanted to go out and do this shift, and so he took the only other fisherman in their company that was willing to go or that could go, and it was a 23-year-old, extremely inexperienced, brand new fisherman named Ezequiel Cordoba. And while Jose knew he was not going to be a huge asset out on the seas, he figured, it's a short trip and we're not that far off from shore, so you know what, he's fine, I'll take him. On November 17th, the pair set out on their 24-foot fiberglass skiff with a small motor. On board were various fishing tools, a radio, and a large icebox to hold all the fish they were going to catch. Once they reached the area they were going to be fishing, their trip immediately started paying off, and within just a couple of hours, they had already almost completely overloaded the icebox. Their luck was so good that when they saw a storm coming in, they decided to wait and continue to catch as many fish as they possibly could before heading in at the very last minute. But the storm that was rolling in was like the storm of the century, and by the time they did turn around to head into shore, it was too late. They got caught up in this wicked storm where the rain was so intense they literally could not see to shore. They tried to use their compass and other instruments to navigate to shore, but between the winds and the waves and the fact that their boat was so heavy from the nearly 1,000 pounds of fish they had caught, they were just really unable to get anywhere near shore. When the storm just continued to rage and they were just kind of floundering in the water, they decided they needed to dump their catch. So they dumped all 1,000 plus pounds of fish back into the water. But even then, with a more agile boat, the storm was so severe they just could not navigate effectively. And so Jose turned off the engine and told Ezequiel that their best chance here was to just wait it out. And once it was done, they would head back into shore. But that storm continued to rage for 5 days. The torrential rain never stopped, the waves were huge, the winds were awful, and before long they were getting pulled out to sea and had no idea where they were. Now, they had only planned to be out for 30 hours, so they did not have much in the way of supplies. And so after a few days, they had run out of food and they had run out of water, but luckily, because it was raining so much, they were able to drink the rainwater. But the real immediate problem they were facing is over the course of those 5 days, the storm was just battering their boat. And by the time the storm cleared, their boat was ruined. Their motor had been torn off and was just gone. Their electronics were busted and all of their fishing gear was either damaged or gone. There was enough charge in the radio for Jose to call back to his boss on the mainland and send a mayday message, but the radio died before they got a return message, so they weren't able to confirm if anybody on land was going to come looking for them. Left with minimal supplies, no radio, no motor, Jose and Ezequiel just had to hope somebody on the mainland heard their message, and they slowly began to adjust to life at sea. Jose was able to leap into the water and catch turtles, fish, seabirds, and jellyfish with his bare hands, and so that's what they ate. And then the two of them would try to catch rainwater whenever they could, but the majority of the time they had to drink their own urine and turtle blood. Despite their initial optimism that their boss had probably heard their mayday message and would be sending people out to get them, as days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months, they realized that probably no one was coming to find them. Now their only hope was a plane spotted them flying overhead, or perhaps they could drift into a shipping lane and a boat could spot them. But without any way of navigating their boat, they really were just leaving it up to luck. Despite their dire situation, Jose stayed really positive, and he focused on catching food and catching water, and he tracked the time really diligently by tracking the phases of the moon. Ezekiel, however, just did not have a significant role on the boat because he just wasn't skilled enough, and so he found himself sitting in the boat most of the time doing a whole lot of nothing, and he fell into a deep depression. He was not accustomed to being out on the water the way Jose was. Jose had been raised on the water. He practically only ate seafood, and a lot of it he ate raw. So in a way, Jose was kind of at home, Ezekiel was not. And then by the 4th month, Ezekiel just could no longer stomach the food they were eating. He would just get sick every single time. And so he just kind of gave up and he stopped eating. And even though Jose urged him to eat and would get him food, he didn't eat it, and eventually he starved to death. Even though Ezekiel was not a huge asset in terms of helping them survive, he did provide Jose an enormous amount of comfort. It was like you had your partner in crime here. And then once he died, Jose was alone for the first time in nearly half a year, and he fell into a very dark depression. And for 6 days, he did not touch Ezekiel's body. He just sat there and stared at him and even contemplated taking his own life. But on the 7th day, he doesn't know what it was, but he had this sudden urge to want to survive. And so he gave Ezekiel a kind of makeshift funeral. He said a few words and then disposed of his body in the ocean. And then after that, Jose became laser focused on just surviving. And survive he would for another 9 months, all by himself, out in the middle of the ocean, just floating around, drinking turtle's blood and drinking his own pee. But after those 9 months, he would finally see the thing he had been dreaming about: land. He had managed to drift all the way to the Marshall Islands. So he leapt out of his boat, he swam to shore, and there was a hut right on the beach. He knocked on the hut, and a couple came to the door, and they were totally shocked to see this guy. He didn't look too good, and they couldn't even believe his story. They couldn't believe that he had survived for so long in the water. But they quickly brought him inside, they gave him some food and drink, and they contacted authorities, and he was saved. His parents and young daughter, when they found out he was alive, they were overjoyed. They, along with everybody else, believed he had perished. They had sent out a search party for them, and they'd found pieces of their boat that had broken off in the storm, and so they assumed, they must have sank. Then, in a strange turn of events, shortly after he got home, people began accusing him of lying about what happened. People said he looked too good to have been out on the open ocean for 14 months. He should have been emaciated, and at the very least, he should have had scurvy. But doctors would say he ate so many turtles and seabirds that he was pretty well fed. And turtles and seabirds contain a high level of vitamin C that would have protected him from scurvy. Other skeptics said it would have been impossible for his skiff to float the 6,000 miles to the Marshall Islands where he ultimately found land. But then a study done at the University of Hawaii confirmed there was a current that would have pulled him from the coast of Mexico straight into the Marshall Islands. And then lastly, Ezekiel Cordoba's family accused Jose of killing Ezekiel and eating his body for sustenance. That's the only way he was able to survive. But Ezekiel roundly rejected that and took multiple lie detector tests that proved he did not do that. Today, Jose lives in a small town in El Salvador, completely surrounded by land, and he says he doesn't go anywhere near the water.
The next story is called El Fausto.
On July 20th, 1968, a small fishing boat called El Fausto took off from their port on La Palma Island, which is part of the Canary Islands, which is a Spanish archipelago, and they took off for El Hierro, which was another island about 50 miles to the south. On board El Fausto were 3 very experienced fishermen and sailors. They were the brothers Ramon and Eliberto Hernandez, as well as their cousin Miguel Acosta. Their trip to El Hierro was uneventful. It took about 7 hours. They arrived at the port in the early evening hours, and they unloaded their cargo onto the island, which was actually explosives used in agriculture. So they unloaded all that, and then the 3 of them went to get some food and relax for a few minutes before they came back to the dock and began preparing to leave. So that evening, as the 3 men are standing on their boat, repacking the ship, and getting ready to leave in the next few minutes, they see this man running down the dock who's frantically waving at them, trying to get their attention. And so they stop what they're doing and they beckon him over and say, what do you need? And the man introduced himself as Julio Garcia. He was clearly very upset. He was talking really quickly, and they had to slow him down a couple times to try to understand what he was saying. But he communicated that his wife had called him earlier that day, and she said their 2-year-old daughter was very sick and he needed to come home right away. And he ran down to catch the ferry back to his home island of La Palma, so the same island these 3 men are from, and he missed the ferry. And the next ferry going back to his home island was not for another 2 days. And so Julio was running up and down the dock trying to flag anybody who owned a ship that might be willing to take him to La Palma, even if it was out of the way. He was prepared to pay for it. And so, of course, the El Fausto crew said, we're actually going to La Palma. We live there too, and we'd be happy to take you. You don't need to pay for this. And so Julio begins to help them load the rest of their equipment onto the boat, which included some food. They had 22 pounds of fruit and they had some fresh water. And then once everything was loaded up, they undid their lines and they set sail for La Palma. They took off at about 2:30 in the morning on July 21st. The water was very calm during their return trip. The only thing they had to contend with was a light mist that formed over the water in the early morning hours right after the sun came up, but it really wasn't enough to affect their ability to navigate. But even if the mist was more severe than people realized, Ramon, Eliberto, and Miguel were very experienced sailors that in fact had been sailing on this particular stretch of water ever since they were teenagers, and they had navigated these waters in far worse conditions and had always managed to get through it. But at 10 a.m. that morning, when the Fausto crew was supposed to arrive at La Palma, they didn't. And the owner of the boat itself was waiting at the dock for them, and when they didn't show up, he wasn't overly concerned because he knew these 3 men. He regularly went out on this particular boat with them. In fact, he normally would have gone on the trip to El Hierro with them, but he had commitments on La Palma, so he didn't go. And so he's not particularly worried about them. He figures they ran into some mechanical issue and, they're getting it figured out, but they're just late. But after a little while, the families of the El Fausto crew started to ask the owner, where are they? Why aren't they here? And so the owner, who again is not overly concerned, but wants to make sure the families are not worrying, says, you know what, I'll send a search boat that will take the exact route El Fausto was on, but in reverse, and I'm sure they can just drive straight out there and they'll run into them and they will help them fix, whatever issue they have, which is more than likely mechanical. That's an old boat, and we've certainly run into other mechanical issues in the past. So this search boat goes out, and for hours and hours and hours, they're looking along the exact same charted course that El Fausto was supposed to be on, and they're nowhere to be found. And so they radio back in to the owner of the boat, and they say, look, we can't find him. What do you want us to do? And he called them back in, and he realized that, you know what, if we can't find them anywhere near the route, that probably something more sinister has happened to them. And it was at this point that he got in touch with authorities, and they launched a much more formal search and rescue effort. Planes and boats spilled out over the sea to look for El Fausto and her crew, and everybody who was looking was operating with an enormous sense of urgency because anybody who was looking had been told these guys don't have much in the way of supplies. They have 22 pounds of fruit and they have a very limited freshwater supply. And so if we don't find them within a couple of days, there's a very good chance that we're going to find 4 corpses. But despite searchers' motivation to find these guys, a couple of days passed and there was no sign of them. And unfortunately, people did start to think, I think it's more likely we're going to find 4 dead bodies than 4 sailors waiting to be rescued. But on July 25th, 4 days after El Fausto left El Hierro on their way to La Palma and then, of course, got lost, 4 days after that, a British ship called Duquesa radioed in an incredible message. They said they had found this fishing boat that was drifting along, and there was 4 people standing on the deck, and they were waving flashlights around to try to get their attention. And as this British ship moved up closer to the fishing boat, they were able to read on the hull the call sign of the boat, and it was, of course, El Fausto. Where El Fausto had been found was 120 miles west of La Palma, so they had drifted way, way off course. But once they pulled up alongside of them, they could see that not only were the 4 crew members alive, they actually seemed like they were in pretty good spirits. They certainly were dehydrated and were very thankful to get some water, and they were starving, and they were obviously pretty freaked out because they had just been adrift in the middle of the ocean and probably were realizing that this could end really badly for us. But beyond all that, they seemed okay. And very quickly, that message was passed to friends and family of the El Fausto crew back on La Palma, who's waiting anxiously to hear any news about their loved ones. And when they were told they had been found and they were alive, they were overjoyed because they thought they were dead. But after the initial transmission had been sent out by Duquesa saying, hey, we found the crew and they're alive and they're good, well, a couple hours went by and the Duquesa sent another transmission that was very strange. They said the crew of El Fausto was refusing to be towed back home. They were saying that our boat's just fine, we're good, we just need a couple of supplies and we'll be on our way. And so the captain of Duquesa says to the men, then why are you out here? How did you get 120 miles west of La Palma? Something had to have gone wrong with your boat. So what happened? But the men didn't really answer his question. They just said, oh no, there's nothing wrong with our boat. There's no mechanical issues. Everything's fine. We appreciate your offer, but we just need a couple of supplies and we'll be on our way. Even Julio, who had made this special effort to get home to his sick daughter and to see his wife, even he is saying, nope, we don't need a tow, we're good. And so the captain of the Duquesa is looking at these guys thinking, what am I missing here? You just drifted 120 miles away. You probably should have died. You're very lucky that we happened to find you in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Had we not found you, you probably would have died of dehydration in the next couple of days. And so we found you. We're offering to bring you to shore to guarantee that you will get to see your sick daughter and to see your wife and for you all to see your families and your friends. And you're telling us to leave and you're telling us that there's nothing wrong with your boat when clearly something happened. But the captain of the Duquesa could not convince them to get towed in. They were totally not going to do it. And apparently they were very polite about it. They said, look, we really appreciate the offer, but really our boat is just fine. We just need some food, water, cigarettes, and some fuel, and we'll be good. And so ultimately, the crew of the Duquesa obliged their request, and they gave them 18 hours worth of fuel along with a whole bunch of cigarettes and water and food. And they watched as the four men sailed east towards La Palma, and they were waving the whole time. Everything seemed fine. And then they vanished over the horizon. And the captain of Duquesa would call in over the radio that based on where they were and how close they were to La Palma, they should expect to see them arriving at port at about 7 p.m. that night. Back on La Palma, friends, family, and hundreds of other people from the island went down to the dock and were drinking wine and having a big party, celebrating the imminent return of their friends and their loved ones. But unfortunately, 7 p.m. came and went, and they didn't show up. And so, of course, the family of the crew became very worried that, oh my gosh, this nightmare is starting all over again. And the owner of El Fausto came over to them and reassured them that he's been in touch with the authorities who were speaking to the captain of the Duquesa, who were speaking to our friends and family and loved ones on El Fausto, and everything's fine. They have all the supplies they need. They have all the fuel they need. I'm sure they're just running a little bit late. Everything is totally fine. And so friends and family and some diehard supporters stayed down at the dock for several more hours until it became clear that something's gone wrong, and unfortunately this nightmare is not over. The next morning, after El Fausto and her crew were once again labeled missing, Spain kicked off their largest ever search for missing people. They had bombers flying overhead, they had military and civilian ships all over the area where the Duquesa had made contact with El Fausto. They had so many people combing the water, so many planes overhead, and for 2 weeks they looked everywhere and they couldn't find anything. And finally they had to call it off, and they said, look, we don't know what happened to them. And they declared them lost at sea, which basically meant we think they're dead, but we'll probably never know for sure. 2 months later, on October 9th, an Italian merchant ship called the Anna de Mayo, who was on their way to Venezuela, spotted a small fishing boat way off in the distance that was just bobbing around aimlessly. And the first thing they noticed was this ship is far too small to be making a cross-oceanic voyage. They shouldn't be out here. And as they got closer, they could tell that there was no one standing on deck or in the cabin. There's no one driving this boat. And so finally they got so close they could read the hull, and it says El Fausto. So the Anna de Mayo pulls up right alongside El Fausto. They tether themselves together so it doesn't float away. And two of the Italian sailors get on board El Fausto, and they're yelling out to see if anybody's there, but no one's responding. And they're looking around, and the ship is in great condition. There's no sign of obvious damage or any violence that might have taken place on here. They go into the cabin where the steering wheel is, and they're looking for some sort of logbook that would have documented, what happened on the ship. But there's no logbook, And so the Italians were left scratching their head thinking, how could a perfectly seaworthy boat wind up abandoned in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? Where's their crew? But they still needed to go down below into the little space that was the engine room. And so the two sailors that had boarded to look around, they make their way over to the section of the deck where there's this hatch that they open up, and they look down and they smell this horrible smell, and they turn on their light and they're met with this horrible and inexplicable scene. Laying on the ground inside of the engine room on his back was a dead man who was partially mummified, he had no clothes on, and he was clutching a transistor radio. And so the two Italians that found him, they stepped back and they had to compose themselves. And then one of them actually went down to look around for clues and see if perhaps there's other bodies down there. And so when he went down, it was just the one body, and he could only find one other clue. And it was this small notebook that was positioned right behind the dead body that they didn't see when they first looked down. So the Italian sailors leave the engine room and they take the notebook back to their ship. And they open it up, and the first thing they see is the middle section of the notebook has been torn out. In fact, 28 pages were missing. And all they were left with was a couple of pages at the beginning and a single page at the end. The first couple of pages just were a couple of notes and some simple math calculations. Nothing significant. The last page appeared to be a farewell of sorts, but the language that was used was a little bit confusing and it was difficult to read, and so the Italians were not entirely sure what any of it actually meant. And so they figured it would be best to just give the notebook to authorities and they could figure out what it meant. And so the captain of the Ana de Mayo radios in to Spanish authorities that they've found El Fausto and that they intend to tow it back to Venezuela where they were already going, at which point they'll turn over everything they found and authorities can take it from there. So the Italians put a tow line on the bow of El Fausto and began towing. 2 days later, Spanish authorities received a crushing telegram. Apparently the night before, as El Fausto was being towed, it suddenly lurched forward and went bow down into the water and sunk so rapidly that it ripped the tow line off of the back of the Ana de Mayo and was underwater well before they could do anything to try to stop it. The crew of the Ana de Mayo swore they had followed procedure and they knew what they were doing, and this was just kind of a freak thing, but regardless of how or why it happened, the ship was now gone, and so too was the dead body, so they couldn't even positively identify whoever that was. All they had was that notebook they recovered from inside the engine room. The notebook was sent to La Palma, where it was put in front of the families of the 4 men who were on El Fausto, and very quickly, Julio's wife was able to identify his handwriting. He apparently had a unique way of writing, and she was used to reading it, and so she said, that's definitely his writing, and in fact, I recognize that notebook. He kept that notebook to track payments because he was a mechanic and people requested his services, and that's what he used to track payments. This, of course, meant the dead man inside of the engine room was almost certainly Julio. Julio's wife examined the notebook and she was able to decipher that last page, at least most of it, and she said it was this very detailed description of exactly what she needed to do once he died, because clearly, based on the way he was writing, he knew he was about to die. And at first it says, here's how you access my insurance policy, and here are the different properties I own, and how you go about selling them. And then in his final moments, he scrawled one last message at the very bottom of the last page that said, "Don't ever tell our son all that has happened to me. You know that God wanted this fate for me. Love you." So if Julio was so sure he was about to die that he would take the time to write out a detailed list of instructions for his wife to follow when he died, well then why didn't he take the time to also offer a small explanation as to what happened to he and the other crew members of El Fausto? He had to have known that whoever was going to find his dead body and this notebook was going to have an awful lot of questions. Unless he did know that and did write a description, except it was in those 28 pages in the middle of the notebook that had been removed. And if that's the case, then who removed them and why? And where's the rest of the El Fausto crew? And why did they tell the Duquesa that nothing was wrong with their ship? And why didn't they take the tow into shore, which would have guaranteed their safety? There's just so many questions that have never been answered in 50 years. The most widely accepted theory is the crew of El Fausto experienced a series of small but compounding setbacks that, combined with panic, led to really bad decision-making and ultimately their death. Others say there are just too many anomalies and oddities about this case to just be a product of bad decision-making, that there has to be something else going on. And so there are lots of alternative theories about what happened, ranging from abduction to illegal trafficking gone wrong, to perhaps they saw something they shouldn't have. But sadly, no one will know for sure what happened to these guys until there is a major break in the case. And at this point, people are just hoping those missing 28 pages turn up and that those will be able to explain what happened to El Fausto and her crew.
The next and final story is called El Faro.
On September 29, 2015, a tropical storm named Joaquin was swirling off in the Atlantic, and forecasters were having a hard time determining how big it was going to be, how fast it was going to be, and where it was going to end up. On shore, 53-year-old Captain Michael Davidson was struggling too. He was supposed to pilot his enormous cargo ship, the El Faro, from where he was in Florida all the way out to Puerto Rico, a 2,600-mile journey that would put he and the rest of his 32-person crew directly in the path of this storm. The year before, Davidson had been passed over for a promotion for a younger, more tech-savvy captain, and so now Davidson felt like he had something to prove. As he looked out over the calm water and the clear sky, he made a fateful decision. Every agency out there was telling him to not set sail until the storm had passed. But with 37 years of experience, Davidson felt differently. He felt like he could outrun this storm. Feeling suddenly motivated and confident, Davidson boarded the El Faro, hopped on the intercom, and informed his crew that they would not be waiting out the storm. Instead, they would be sailing right by it. As El Faro cast off her lines and headed southward, the governors of New Jersey, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Maryland all declared states of emergency. As the sound of El Faro's diesel engine faded over the horizon, cyclone warnings and hurricane warnings went up around the Bahamas. Schools on the islands began closing, flights were grounded, and cruise ships were diverted. Residents of one island were ordered to evacuate, and on another, police forcibly removed every occupant on this island as floodwater rose. But the first few hours of El Faro's journey were totally uneventful. But as they got closer and closer to the storm, the wind picked up and the waves grew dramatically. By nightfall, the ship was rocking so aggressively side to side that it made sleep almost impossible. By the following morning, the rain was so intense the visibility was basically zero, and the waves were now so massive that none of the crew dared go out on the deck in fear of being swept overboard. The ship's navigator told Captain Davidson that he thought this storm was a lot worse than they were expecting, and that they should really consider turning around before it was too late. Davidson and the navigator were not the only ones up on the bridge, which is where the ship is actually steered from. There was also a black box that was anchored up on the wall behind them that recorded all of the conversations that happened up there. And the black box would record increasingly anxious conversations between the crew and Davidson as they voiced their concerns about the storm. But Davidson was totally unfazed. He was adamant that the storm was not going to get any worse than what they were seeing right then and there. And even if it did get worse, they were never going to be actually in the storm's eye, and so they weren't in any real danger. But to reassure his crew, he ordered his navigator to make a slight right so everybody on board saw they were taking a wider berth around the storm. One of the crew members, a 34-year-old woman named Danielle Randolph, was not reassured by this slight right. She was a hard worker from a military family and always followed orders, but she just could not understand why Davidson was not taking the storm seriously. And so that evening, after the sun had set, Danielle very carefully stumbled her way up the stairs to the navigational bridge because the ship is still rocking violently side to side, and when she got up there, she thought she would just check the weather for herself. The black box anchored to the wall recorded her discovery. The El Faro was not going to sidestep the storm. It was sailing directly into it. You can hear the fear and surprise as Danielle turns to Davidson and says, "We're sailing right through the eye." There was a silence on the recording as Davidson must have looked down at the computer screen that Danielle had pulled up to show him the storm and their course that was going right into it. And Davidson, after he realized his mistake, has this very eerily calm tone where he says to the navigator, "Okay, I need you to make another slight right." And he assured everybody on the bridge that that would be enough, that that would fix this mistake. But Danielle was not buying it. And so as professionally and respectfully as she could, she says to her captain, "This is a really bad idea. We really need to turn around right now. It's getting to the point where it's going to be too late and we won't be able to turn around." But Davidson wasn't having it. And so he told Danielle and the navigator and the other people on the bridge that they were not in danger, that everything's just fine. This is just like the storms he had been through when he used to work in Alaska, and they would get through this one too. Davidson was so confident in his decision-making that he told them he was going to go take a nap downstairs, and if they really needed him, if something serious happened, go and get him. And with that, he left the bridge and went down to his room. As the minutes of the night ticked by, Danielle stayed up in the bridge, and she braced herself against a steel girder and looked out the window at the rain that was just slashing across the window and the waves that were the size of 3-story houses crashing in on either side of them. And then by the morning, when the sun came up, the sky just stayed totally black because they were right outside the eye of the storm. Suddenly, under their feet, Danielle and the navigator and the other people up on the bridge heard this awful clanging metal sound as the constant rocking of the ship had finally loosened up the straps, holding down these massive metal containers down in the cargo hold, and they were now loose, smashing into the inside of the ship. And then they heard an even worse sound, and the black box recorded it too. And that was the shrill of an alarm that meant Alfaro was taking on water. Danielle left the window and ran around to the radar screen to see if there was any ships in the area that might be able to help them. But when she looked, there was no blips on the screen. All the other ships had diverted to avoid this storm. Alfaro was totally alone. At the sound of the alarm, Davidson came running back up to the bridge, and you hear him on the black box, and he sounds like someone who's acting calm, but there's a tightness in his voice that he's trying to conceal the fact that he's actually probably quite scared. Because at this point, the reality was the Alfaro was now too close to the eye of the storm, and they would be unable to escape its grasp. They were going to get pulled into the eye of this hurricane. Furious with her captain, she brushed past him without saying anything, and then very carefully made her way down the stairs to her room. And the whole time she was walking, she would have been barely able to stand, because now with those loose shipping containers down in the cargo hold, the ship would rock even farther to each side, because as soon as it tilted one way, the containers would slam into the wall, driving it even farther into the water. When she finally staggered her way down and got to her door, she would have opened it up and her whole room would have been trashed. Everything that wasn't anchored down had been tossed all over the room, all of her clothes, any furniture would have been dumped all over the room. But she didn't care about any of her stuff on the ground. She only wanted her laptop. She found it, it was on the ground, she picked it up, she put it on her desk that was bolted down, and very carefully she opened it up and she opened her email. As the alarms are shrieking in the background and she can hear the sound of these shipping containers smashing into the inside of the cargo hold, she writes this note to her mother where she tells her the winds are really bad and it looks like they're sailing right for the center of this storm. And she's about to hit send when she stops for a second, she looks at her computer screen, and she adds one more line. Love to everyone. Danielle never said things like this. She was always strictly business. And so for her to put that line was an acknowledgement that this might be the last time she ever talks to her family. Shortly after Danielle hit send on that email, the ship listed hard to one side and then it stayed there. The loose containers down in the cargo hold had finally shifted the ship's center of gravity. Water immediately began pouring into the lower sections of Alfaro. Danielle knew it was only a matter of time before the water reached her, and so she leapt out of her room and ran down the hall, which was now sideways. She got to the stairwell and climbed her way up to the bridge. As soon as she got up there, all the people on the bridge were holding onto the center console so they didn't fall up against the wall, and she heard Davidson ordering the navigator to turn the ship into the wind. It was a last-ditch Hail Mary effort where Davidson believed the wind was so strong it would blow the ship back upright. If this didn't work, the ship was going to sink. And so the navigator began desperately turning the wheel, the lights inside of the bridge began to flicker, and the engines growled and vibrated as it churned, trying desperately to get up and over this enormous wave. But as they were just about to crest the top, the engines completely died and it went silent in the bridge. And so now that Alfaro is without power, it's just sitting idle in the middle of the storm, and it's getting smashed by these 3-story high waves, and it begins to force the nose of this giant ship to go under and stay under. Davidson breaks the silence by hitting the emergency beacon that notifies the Coast Guard, and then he screams to everybody on the bridge to go downstairs and wake everyone up. We have to get off this ship. On the black box, a new sound is heard, the abandoned ship alarm. At this point, the black box faintly picks up Davidson screaming from somewhere outside of the bridge for people to get in the rafts, get off the boat, get in the water. By this point, the back of the Alfaro would have been off the water and the nose would have been almost pointed straight down. And so Davidson is heard coming back up into the bridge, but at this point, the bridge is sideways. It's looking straight down at the water. And it's clear there is another crew member that is stuck inside of the bridge, and he's yelling out to Davidson, Cap, you gotta help me. And Davidson is trying to find him, and he's yelling for him to come to him. And the man tells him he's stuck, he can't go anywhere, he's a goner. And Davidson, with the final words uttered on this black box, would yell to this man, "I'm not leaving you. It's time to come this way." And then the black box would cut out because the black box was now underwater. For 3 days, searchers could not even get close to the El Faro wreckage because of the storm. But when they did finally get there, all they could find were 3 life rings, 2 life rafts, and the starboard lifeboat that had been crushed on both sides. A Coast Guard helicopter found a body floating around some of this wreckage, but when they went down to retrieve it, it slipped under the water. 5 days after El Faro's last frantic plea for help, the Coast Guard declared the ship had sunk and everyone on board had died.
Morning stretches through the treetops, painting gold along the breeze. I can hear the quiet footsteps of a message meant for me. Feather light, the echo lingers, calling softly through the air, like a whisper from the heavens only dreamers learn to bear. Every moment feels anew, as if the sky is breaking through.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please raise the 5-star review button's office chair all the way up and then break off the handle. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My